Welcome back to the SENWA studios out here at Optus Stadium. Cloudy, clearing in Perth today, a maximum temperature of 27 degrees later in the day. Jonathon Horn is the sports columnist at The Guardian. He joins us on the show now. Jonathon, welcome.
Morning, Duff. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, mate. Keen to get an East Coast perspective on a few things this morning. First of all, the start by the two WA clubs at the weekend. Not great.
Not great. I probably have a slightly different take to maybe some of the coverage of the Dockers, I guess, from their game. One of those rare occasions, I think, that maybe I'd verge on giving a mulligan to that game, to the Dockers. It was such a strange game, I thought. It was just one of those games where... It was just one of those typical Cardinia Park Chris Scott games where he had his stamp on that game. You could tell about 90 seconds into that game, this is going to be a Chris Scott game. He had them set up exactly as they wanted. It was such a... Like, even the conditions, it was a stinking hot day. The players were absolutely knackered, even, both teams at the breaks. I just thought that... I thought that the Dockers selected a really strange team. I thought it was a really sort of lopsided team that they selected. I just think they got a lot wrong, and it was just one of those games that can be rectified, I think. I think if you were to take any sort of optimism out of a performance like that, I think there is sort of silver lining out of that game for them.
What about West Coast against Gold Coast on Sunday?
That's probably a slightly different perspective. I thought I just saw what everyone else saw. I saw a team that was just absolutely walloped by, may I say, a pretty formidable, much better team than I was expecting, in terms of, we've all seen the way that Gold Coast travel or don't travel in the past, but they turned up on Sunday and they were absolutely awesome. And look, my views on that game would probably echo everyone in Perth who saw that, is it was just completely and utterly outclassed, really disappointing. And also, in a round one game where your fans come along to be essentially over at quarter time, it's pretty deflating, and there's been obviously a lot of other negative things that have come out of that game for the Eagles. So yeah, really disappointing start for Andrew McAuliffe.
We'll get back onto the Eagles in a minute, but as strange as it is to say, after talking about the performances of our two clubs on the weekend, I'm not sure they were the worst losses on the weekend. Carlton were 41 points up against a team that no one expected to win a game this year, and they got beaten. How much pressure is on the Blues, and how much pressure is on Michael Voss now?
I sometimes think that Vossi gets a lot of leeway from the media over here, I think, sort of by dint of the player he was, the record he has, which is all fair enough. I think that the heat has never really come for him and his coaching. I think those questions are going to be asked a lot more, I think, in the next month. They play some really good teams in the next month, and also some really well-coached teams as well, which is going to challenge Carlton to see if they have the flexibility and the gears to sort of change and adapt, which is something that they haven't shown, I think, in the last few years even. I think that they're very much... Vossi has this sort of, I guess, philosophy, keep pounding the rock, he says. He said it at the Best and Fairest last year. And it's sort of this idea of, just keep doing what we're good at and keep plugging away and things will turn. The question is the way that they play, even when they're playing well, whether that suits how modern footy's been played. And I've got doubts over that. And I think that to look at a team like Hawthorn, who plays very differently to Carlton, I think that shows that the way the modern game is trending. So, look, I think the pressure's enormous, and I think that once they get over, the next 3 weeks, suddenly their draw opens up a bit, and they actually, I think, play West Coast twice in 2 months or something like that. I think that they back up pretty quickly. So, but they've got to get over Hawthorn, and they've got to get over Collingwood, and I think if they're 0-3 or 0-4, the heat's going to come for Carlton, and it always does. They're a very engaged supporter base. They're a supporter base. This is the longest premiership drought in their history now. And I think that there's this anxiety that's growing around Carlton about, are they going to waste another generation of really high draft picks and a lot of promise?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Most teams, one of the first things they try and do is stabilise their backline and settle their backline. I get the feeling that Carlton have actually destabilised their backline over summer, and I watched them in the game against Richmond. Really, if you talk about the story of the game, we love the poetry and the romance of Richmond's kids and how they got speed on the game and how Sam Lawler bobbed up and a couple of other players bobbed up as well. I think Trainer was very good. But really the story of the game was 5 goals from defensive 50 turnovers for Carlton. And if you're having that many stuff-ups at the back, you're going to lose most of the games you play in. What can they do to get back to a solid and reliable back six? Because in that game, they were anything but.
I'm not sure. I'm just not convinced that they've always had the second tall to help out Wiedering. And I also think that there's just some players who fly under the radar sometimes that you can just never afford to lose. And they lost one in Nick Newman, who was kind of that player, just exactly the sort of player they needed on Thursday night. He's a lovely kick, and they've got some really sloppy kicks back there. He's also a really good leader. He's got a cool head. He's the guy who's barking out instructions and telling people where to stand and what to do. And when he went down with his ACL, I think that he was just one of those players that we're only probably appreciating how good he was. They definitely missed him on Thursday. I'm not convinced that Jack Silvani is a defender. I think he's more of a sort of hybrid kind of deploy where required type player. I think it is their biggest issue. I think, like you said, that they, apart from Wiedering, who was so good in that first half, they just look like a shambles back there. And I think that, especially against a team like Hawthorn, who are so sort of interchangeable, and their forwards, the way they swap around and confuse opposition defences, I think that's something that's really going to challenge Carlton.
That's a good call, and I thought the same thing, that Nick Newman became a massive out. I was surprised that in the light of Nick Newman being out, that they didn't try and put a bit of experience and solidity back there by playing Doherty. I was surprised that he was the sub, and to me that maybe he wouldn't have made some of the panicked mistakes that some of their other defenders did. And if you contrast down the other end, when the game got tight late and Richmond had hit the front and Carlton were trying to come again, the reliability and experience of Lostone and Broad back at the other end was something that Carlton just didn't have.
Yeah, exactly. They're two very dependable players who have, on a separate issue, just, two players who have stuck around and who are going to do some hard yards at Richmond. But yeah, like you said, they just need that cool head, and they need players with a clean set of hands. Obviously, that was a really wet ball last Thursday, but both teams were playing with the same ball, and a bunch of kids handled it well, and supposedly senior players didn't.
Harley Reid has been the focus of a lot of attention, as he has been since he entered the game as the number 1 draft pick last season. What's been made of his performance against Gold Coast over there, and what do you think consequences come out of that as far as he's concerned and as far as West Coast are concerned in terms of whether he's there at the club next year?
Yeah, I heard your comments on Harley, Duff, and I pretty much agree with what you said. I'm not sure if you copped a bit of backlash for that, but I think you were pretty spot on with what you said. Look, the Sharks are circling in terms of the clubs opening up their cap space and getting the right draft picks and so on in order to think that they can land him. I just think that it's a fascinating contrast with Reid. When you look at this round, so many high draft picks did really well, and it was almost this kind of, how easy is this sort of caper. And I think that a lot of those guys, Lawler and, those high draft picks who did well in round 1, Reid would have played against and even with when they were underages. So he would sort of be familiar with those guys. Look, I think that he's the reality of how hard it is probably hitting home, but also he's obviously been targeted now, and I think there's certain coaches that zero in on that, opposition coaches. I remember last year in that St Kilda game when Ross Lyon sent Windhager to him after half time. I think that was really instructive that day. I think that was the first time we've really seen him get frustrated. And I think also in that, maybe the second last game of the year against Carlton, he had a really tough day that day. I'm not sure if he was matched up against Cripps, but it was just he was probably cooked by that time of year. And I think that, you know, a coach like Hardwick is always going to play hardball with a guy like, in terms of the instructions to his players, you know, how to get under a young player's skin. And he's obviously someone whose skin you can get under. It's and like you said, you know, anyone who's played footy knows how much energy you waste just wrestling and things like that. It's absolutely sapping, and I think that's obviously not helping his game at all. Like, one thing that really stands out to me is the absence of Yo and the absence, you know, the sort of buffer that both physically and emotionally that he gave him last year. When Yo was playing well, Reid was playing well. I think he's a massive loss, and I think that you saw again in those debuts this week, like someone like Lawler, the protection he got from some of those senior players was really, really interesting. Just the way, say that Nankervis and those guys you mentioned around him, you know, even having someone like Tom Lynch, who's a very physical and vocal player out on the field. I just feel like Reid's lacking that at the moment. I think the leadership at West Coast isn't really in and around the ball. It's sort of, you know, it's obviously the captain plays further afield and you've got leaders down back and so on. So, look, it's part of me feels like they're not going to get, surely things aren't going to get much worse than what happened on Saturday in terms of what Gold Coast midfield dished up. But the problem for Reid and the pressure is that there's a blueprint now, and I think that a lot of the more ruthless coaches and the teams with players who are willing to execute it will go after him now, and it's up to Reid and those players around him to sort of absorb that and learn from it and get better from it.
Yeah, it's a ruthless industry and he's an exceptional talent, so there's going to be attention paid to him. There was a big tribunal hearing last night. Jackson Archer, the 3-week ban stood. It was a very tough call for the tribunal to make. I reckon a real split-second incident. I agree that the suspension should stand. What was your take on it?
Yeah, look, I agree. I just, part of me thinks it's a shame. Like, there's part of that football brain that thinks, geez, I wish we could teach young players, if I'm teaching an under-12s footballer, that to teach him to do what young Archer did. And I think that, I guess we have to get out of that mentality and that mindset now. You know, like you, I saw his dad play. His dad was the most courageous, probably reckless footballer I've ever seen. Play the game. And I just think that you almost just cannot do that now. I think that sense of, you know, I think one of the quotes from the tribunal was that he slowed too little too late. And I think that that's true. I think that maybe 10, 15 years ago, that would have been highlighted in a coach's meeting as exactly the sort of thing you want from your player. But that's going out of the game. And, you know, part of me thinks it's a shame that they get 3 weeks or something like that, but we need obviously clear guidelines. And in the end, I know there's been a lot of debate about it, but to me that was pretty clear cut that he had to be suspended for that.
One more before I let you go. Port Adelaide, absolutely belted by Collingwood. Can the handover work, or do you think they maybe should make the call quickly?
Well, this was always the concern. If they got belted early, that suddenly you're looking at what is the season's never been longer, and suddenly you'd be looking at, you know, 6 months of this. Look, Port have never been good at the MCG in the last few years. They've got a fantastic record at Marvel Stadium, but they've got a horrible record at the MCG and against Collingwood. No Zach Butters as well. They're a completely different team without him. And I just think that, look, it's the sort of thing that looks good on paper it looked good at the press conference with Koshy. It was good PR. And I think now that everyone at Port is seeing the reality of what's ahead and that it's looking pretty grim, and to me it looks untenable at the moment.
Jonathan, thanks so much for your time this morning. Look forward to further input from you as the season unfolds, and really appreciate your thoughts on all those matters. Very measured, I think. Thanks for joining us.
No worries, Doc. Thanks, mate.
Jonathon Horn, he's the sports columnist for The Guardian. For Pauline Dinella, we'll come to you straight after the news. Thanks for hanging on the line. He wants to talk about Oscar Allen. It's called through on the Barrett and Dede open line. But first, we'll take some news.